You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology, are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 27. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader. And today, we're discussing OOPARTS, out-of-place artifacts. Things like Roman swords found in Canada, or mysterious Viking buildings discovered in Rhode Island. We're going to help you identify what exactly an OOPART is, and we'll look over the three categories that Ken has devised to describe the different types of OOPARTs that are out there. Stick around and get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Okay, so hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. How's it going, Ken?
It's going really well. We finally, here in New England, had snow. We didn't, we looked outside, didn't know what that white stuff was. It's not a lot. But they are talking about, we had last week, it was 70 degrees, like on Christmas Eve. But at least now it's in the 30s and we've got some ice and snow. So it's kind of, it seems like it's more winter-like. But when you had 70 degrees one day and like the next week it drops 40 degrees, it's kind of shocking. But we'll get used to it, I'm sure.
So Ken, this is a very important episode. Do you know what episode it is?
What you mean? What number it is?
I know what number it is now, but do you know what the importance of this episode is?
What is the importance of this episode, Sarah?
This episode is our 1-year anniversary episode.
Is it actually that? Wow.
I believe so. Yes, I believe that by the time this podcast airs, I think the podcast will officially be a year old.
Wow. Now, when should we be expecting our anniversary gifts from Chris?
Soon, I hope.
It's in the mail. It's on back order. It's
right.
All right.
Right. It's those awesome T-shirts that we haven't made yet.
Yeah, I tell students in my experimental archaeology class that if they sign up for the class, they get a free toaster with every enrollment.
Nice.
And then at the end of the semester, they go, where's the toaster? I tell them, well, it's on back order. You gotta wait.
Back order.
It's on back order for years now. Yeah.
So speaking of toasters and missing toasters. We are going to cover out-of-place objects again because there's so much to talk about these particular types of objects.
Yeah, and there really is, Sarah. And I think that this podcast is really going to be a lead-in to one that we hope to do with Andy White about something that's been in the news. You cannot open your computer and look at your news feeds without seeing something about how, yet again, somebody has discovered an artifact that's going to cause us to all go back and rewrite the archaeology books and rewrite the history textbooks. And
yeah, especially. Yeah, go ahead. No,
I'm just saying that what we're talking about here is the discovery, and it's hard in a podcast to put scare quotes around the term, but let's put those around the word discovery. But the discovery of a Roman sword in ostensibly is a shipwreck off the coast of Nova Scotia, and therefore leading people to the conclusion, leading some people to the conclusion that, oh my God, Romans were here long before Columbus, long before the Norse, and were present in the New World, showing that, in fact, diffusionists are correct, that the Atlantic was a highway for Old World people, and maybe the Pacific as well, coming here, again, long before historically, at least previously historically validated migrations and explorations.
So we could actually we could actually cover two topics that we've gone over before, and that's OOPARTS, the out-of-place objects, and also the whole Europeans in America before we have a record of Europeans being in America.
Well, yeah, I mean, in fact, you're exactly right, Sarah. So, because in other words, what the argument is there are these artifacts that are out of place, both in terms of geography and in terms of chronology. We know that there are Romans in the New World. I have Italian neighbors; they're Romans in the New World, but the argument here is that no, but there is archaeological evidence, just physical evidence of objects here in stratigraphic context that predate the arrival of Columbus or predate the arrival of the Norse in Canada.
Now, it's my understanding that the discovery of the sword did not yield anything else connected to it besides the sword itself.
Well, that's, here the deal is that Andy White, who is doing yeoman's work, this is God's work that he's doing on this topic.
He does do a fine job.
He really does. It's a brilliant piece of research, and which is why we talked about covering this topic. We both, I think, agreed that we've got to get Andy in on this because
Yes.
he has become the expert on the royal. He calls it Swordgate.
Yes.
Yeah, but so I mean, I think that I believe, has been incredibly frustrated getting any kind of. Andy's an archaeologist. You're an archaeologist. I'm an archaeologist. Yeah. We know how this works. We know the kinds of evidence that are absolutely vital and required, in fact, to test hypotheses about the appearance of any group of people at any point in time at any place. And so Andy has been trying valiantly to get the folks behind this discovery to come up with, well, what's the physical, what evidence are we talking about other than the claim that this sword is the real thing, this sword is legit. And again, Sarah, I don't know that anybody knows, but as of right this moment, there's nothing other than the sword and claims about where it was found and how it was found. And even those are kind of sketchy. So no, there is, as far as I know, there's been no claim of the actual Roman ship on which from which the sword was extracted. No claim, no evidence shown that it actually existed, where it was found, who excavated it, what underwater archaeologist actually discovered or recovered evidence from this. So that evidence, it's a big fat zero. I haven't seen anything, and I don't think Andy has found anything providing context, which is all important. This is not just about fringe archaeology. Every archaeologist requires context. When you and I go to somebody's house and find a cigar box full of stone tools, and all that person can tell us is, well, they were found someplace in Connecticut or someplace in Illinois. That sucks. That's no context. We want to know from which field, exactly where, at what depth, in order to assess the significance of that object. So whether we're talking about doing an archaeological site survey or somebody claiming there's an iron sword in Nova Scotia, context, associations are vital. We've talked about this multiple times, but it is a fundamental truth of archaeological research is that context, finding objects in situ, in their original locations, taking accurate measurements, knowing their proveniences is every bit as important as having the object itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a lot of things. We'll discuss the sword a lot more, hopefully, when we get Andy on
exactly.
to share his research with us. But it does lead into, like you said, it does lead into the greater category of the out-of-place objects, which are usually some kind of unexplained thing. In this case, it's an actual historical object that is found completely out of time and out of context.
Yeah, exactly.
And in this situation, in this situation, again, it has nothing else around it to hold it up or to validate it. And in situations where we find legitimate artifacts, historical artifacts that are found out of context or out of time, I guess I should say, they usually have they always have things around them that back up, yes, this is actually culture X, where we were expecting to find culture Y, and here's the other evidence. Here's the trash. Here's the burn pit. Here's a building that's built like that. Looking back at the Viking discovery in Canada several years ago, it started off with the discovery of one little artifact. Well, that made people decide to look more, and as they looked more, they found that whole village there, that whole settlement.
Yeah, L'Anse aux Meadows. And subsequent research, especially by Patricia Sutherland, has shown that there's a thin scatter of Norse artifacts across northeastern Canada
Yes.
that when these can be dated, they can be dated to before Columbus by several hundred years. And I started thinking about this, and I shared with you my taxonomy, if I can go through that, of these kind of out of place artifacts. And we've talked about some of these already in our podcast, which is really nice. We're not being redundant. We're showing how this all is part of a piece. The approach of fringe archaeology. And my first category is just out and out fake artifacts, fraudulent
Yes.
artifacts, hoax
Yes.
artifacts. And these are, in most cases, have been fabricated in order to further a particular agenda or a particular perspective. So, for example, I mean, the most famous archaeological fraud, and I don't think we haven't done a podcast on this, is the Piltdown Man fraud, right? If
Oh,
you
no, we
ask,
haven't.
yeah, I mean, if you ask just about anybody in the universe, name a famous archaeological fraud. Piltdown, if they know anything about archaeology, Piltdown's usually the one they come up with.
Yeah.
Now, Piltdown was an intentional fraud. This wasn't some
Yes.
mistake. It wasn't some goof. It was somebody planted doctored bones in a pit in southern England in order to further a particular agenda. And what they did effectively was they took a relatively recent, maybe medieval skull. They put the jaw of an orangutan, the mandible of an orangutan,
Yes.
which they had stained and then doctored the teeth somewhat, and made it look like the two belonged together, so that an ancient human ancestor, maybe a half a million years old, had been found here in England, and its morphology was like it was a missing link. It was half ape, half human.
And
Um,
specifically, it was Oh, Piltdown is such a great case. I can't believe we haven't done a podcast on this one
we
yet.
should
That's totally
definitely
going to.
do it. Yeah,
I love Piltdown for so many reasons because it shows that the whole reason it was discovered was that national pride. England had never had an hominid found
that's
on
right.
it, and it was designed to look like what they expected the missing link to look like.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it had the human sized skull with the ape jaw as opposed to the other way around, which
Right.
evolution is showing us that we developed completely the opposite way. And then on top of it, like, I love Piltdown because it was the community itself, like the early archaeological community itself, was the one that first called it into question, did all the heavy research, and in the end were they themselves were the ones that said, no, this is a fraud and we're not going to respect it. And I like that because it's this beautiful case of the community creating a fraud for nationalistic purposes, and then the community itself figuring that out and abolishing it, all within the field of archaeology.
Yeah, I mean, I think
And it was
it's a
all because
really,
of science.
yeah, I think it's a really good example, like a test case of what happens when somebody makes a discovery. It doesn't match what people are finding. They don't. This notion that archaeologists will automatically gainsay, automatically um, say no to a discovery that in some way contradicts what our presumptions are. Piltdown shows that that's not true. People were a little skeptical at first, but then many people embraced Piltdown.
Right.
But the community always understood, the archaeological and paleoanthropological community always understood that it was a one-off. What else do we find when we go looking for more of them? They couldn't find any more of them.
Right.
And so that doubt and that skepticism was always there. Science, we talk about science being a self-correcting enterprise.
Right.
That we are constantly proposing hypotheses that turn out not to be working out, and we reject them. And that's the whole point of science. And it's not about anybody's hurt feelings or anybody's egos. It's all about the data. But that Piltdown's a great example of, look, that was absolutely a fake. It was planted to further a particular agenda. Just as you said, the Brits embraced the notion that maybe the first human was an Englishman, and that the first Englishman looked, in terms of its cranium, a lot more modern, a lot more human-like than those ugly Neanderthals that they were finding in Germany.
Right.
And that's what that was all about. We've actually done another example closer to home, and we did a whole podcast on this, are the Newark Holy Stones.
Right.
And again,
Yeah,
in
the
a
Holy
sense,
Stone.
those are out of place artifacts. What the hell is an artifact with Hebrew writing on it doing in Ohio and dating to 2,000 years ago? that's out of place. You'd expect Hebrew writing to be someplace in the Middle East, not in Ohio.
Right.
And again, there we pretty much understand based on the work that Brad Lepper has done, that look, that there was an agenda here about showing the unity of humanity, and if you showed that there were Hebrews in Ohio, it furthered that particular political agenda, and that people embraced that. But we know, based on the physical evidence itself, that the thing was fabricated, that it was a fraudulent artifact. And the same is true, say, of the Michigan relics, which we haven't done a podcast on those guys either, which is a whole series of artifacts found primarily in Michigan, end of the 19th, early 20th centuries, that were, I mean, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of artifacts with various kinds of strange writing on them. And again, these things were clearly not terribly subtle frauds,
Right.
but again, out of place. Why? What are we doing with this kind of cuneiform in Michigan of all places, dating again to maybe thousands of years ago? So,
Well,
but
we
don't,
have the same phenomena with the American runestones as well, in the specifically American Ogum.
yeah, Agam, right, exactly.
They're the same kind of things, and it's interesting to me because of how, especially with the runestones, I don't know so much about, like, with the Michigan relics, because I think everyone pretty much accepts those. Everyone in the professional community pretty much accepts those as frauds. Where the runestones come in, I think, is more interesting because there are, like, especially with the Kensington, there seems to be a whole community identity built around these, and it makes, I mean, there are no American runestones, period, end of discussion. No one in the professional community accepts any of the runestones as being authentic, but a lot of the communities that are built around these runestones do. And since the discovery at Lansdowne Meadows, they also, it's harder now to convince them that no, these really aren't Viking runes, because they're like, but there were Vikings in America. And it's like, well, yeah, but they were in Canada. They weren't in, like, Oklahoma.
It's ironic, isn't it, Sarah? Because now when they say yes, but the Kensington Stone or the Heavener Runestone, those are real because there were Vikings here. But the irony there is, yeah, that actually raises an issue, because in Nova Scotia, in Newfoundland, there's a village. Right, we can show there were people living here. They had a Norse culture, and it dates to 500 years before Columbus. Where are those villages in Minnesota? Where are those villages in Oklahoma? So, in fact, the existence of L'Anse Meadow, you're right, in the minds of some people, show that the likelihood of the runestones of like Kensington and Heavener being legit is increased. But from an archaeological perspective, in fact, it raises the bar pretty damn high for proof, in terms of, all right, well, show us the equivalent of L'Anse Meadow in Minnesota. Show us the equivalent of L'Anse Meadow in Oklahoma. Because if they were there long enough to make, especially in the case of the Kensington Stone, if they were there long enough and there were enough people to be leaving runes around, then they must have lived there. And if they lived there, we should be able to find the equivalent of L'Anse Meadow, the villages associated with those rune stones. And we don't. And I think that is, from an archaeologist's perspective, that is kind of an insurmountable barrier. All these arguments about these very detailed arguments about the epigraphy, about the linguistics of the stones, my eyes start to glaze over, because the bottom line here is, hey, listen, if there's no garbage, there's no people.
Right. Well, we're gonna go to break real quick, and when we come back, we're gonna pick up with this topic and keep going with it, because sure. I think we still have some more ground to cover here.
Whether you're an undergraduate majoring in archaeology or a field tech that's wondering where to go next, the Go Dig a Hole podcast is for you. A new series on the Archaeology Podcast Network. Hosts Christopher and Andy answer a wide range of questions from those new to the field, with help from CRM, academic, and public sector archaeologists. This show is a companion to the blog godigahole.com and tackles questions from readers and listeners to provide a toolkit aimed to help you get a leg up in the competitive field of archaeology. Subscribe to the show via the Archaeology Podcast Network iTunes, or wherever you get podcasts.
And we're back, and we are still talking about out-of-place objects and a little bit of, who got to America first kind of stories. Ken, you're familiar with the Newport Tower. You've written about it and you visited, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been there a couple times. It's a really pretty. I mean, it's a nice, pretty stone tower.
The
And
pictures I've seen are gorgeous. So
yeah, and it's a lovely little place there in Newport, Rhode Island. If you go to Newport, you can also see the mansions people were able to build before there was an income tax. Those
nice.
mansions in Newport are absurd. But the tower itself is really very cool. And there's this long-standing story that in fact the tower was built by the Norse. Um,
Yes.
and the problem there are manifold and multiple problems with that assertion. Not the least of which is that archaeological research was conducted there. I believe it was in late 1940s, early 1950s, where they found effectively colonial artifacts under one of the pillars of the tower. Well,
Right.
that would mean that the tower was built after those artifacts from the 18th century had gotten there. And I think that fundamentally, from an archaeologist's perspective, when you see good stratigraphy, good stratigraphically controlled excavation, and you've got artifacts from the 18th century underlying the tower, we pretty much know that the tower was built after those artifacts got there, so it can't be a 500 or 1,000-year-old Norse tower. The other thing about the Newport Tower is that there's a really good model of that tower built earlier in England by the family of Benedict Arnold.
Yes.
So
not the famous Benedict Arnold.
No.
The mayor of the town, Benedict Arnold.
Right.
Of Newport.
And the tower in the UK, it's a windmill. And in fact, the images we have of that look almost like you took the Newport Tower and just simply put, the windmill superimposed the windmill over it. So we are pretty damn sure, we're absolutely certain that in fact the windmill was built during the colonial period, and we're pretty damn sure we know that in fact it was a windmill.
Right.
But
now, I think it qualifies. Two things. I think it qualifies as a new part only because it's an actual historical artifact that's being interpreted out of context. And could you, very briefly, because you kind of opened us up to this, could you explain the law of stratigraphy? Because we might have some listeners that don't understand the whole concept of stratigraphy and how that works.
Listen, it's really pretty simple. It can get very complicated when, obviously when there has been both cultural or natural processes that have mucked stuff up. But basically, folks, go dig a hole in your ground, go dig a hole in your backyard, and the soil levels that are at the very bottom, they had to have gotten there first because I can't imagine a situation there actually are situations in which you have a cavity and then soil collapses, but in most circumstances it's pretty simple. The Earth's soil is like a book laid kind of with the first page at the bottom, and then as we go down we are going back, we are effectively drilling through a book where the most recent page is on top and the oldest page is on the bottom. And just as you understand the sequence of the pages of a book based on their positioning, it's the same thing with stratigraphy. So if you've got a layer in which 18th century artifacts very clearly are in situ, they've been there since the early 18th century, and you have anything that's been positioned above that or on top of that, necessarily those things that are above it stratigraphically, 99.9% of the time, they are more recent, barring any disturbance, somebody digging a hole in the ground. I mean, I think I've mentioned this in an earlier podcast that we found a 1950s beer bottle in the middle of a 3,000-year-old site,
Right.
but in fact it was in the bottom of a woodchuck barrel. So we have to be very careful about that, and archaeologists are obsessively careful about looking at those stratigraphic levels. So in the case of the Newport Tower, look, I think it was William Godfrey was the archaeologist who excavated it, found a boot print, found nails, found other white clay pipes fragments underneath the footing of that tower, which means the tower came later.
The investigation was directed by Hugh Henkin of Harvard in 1948.
Oh, okay.
And it was headed up, the dig itself was headed by William S. Godfrey.
There you go.
So yeah, no, it's pretty, like, the thing I like about the Newport Tower is there was a later excavation, or a later just kind of going over it kind of thing that was published, and I was able to read through it, and it was pretty cut and dry. It was done by another archaeological group. I forget. I have to dig the report up and put it in the show notes because I can't remember all the details right now. But basically, they come out and they say, "This is a 17th century windmill. We know where it came from. We know who built it. We know why it's here." And they turned that over to the community because the community paid for the excavation itself to be done. And the community was like, "Well, this is cute and all, but yeah, it's still a Viking tower." When, like, that's what I'm talking about with the identity of the community is built around the OOPART, because you see it with the Kensington runestone to some degree.
Yeah.
You see it with this Newport Tower, and I see it in other places. Down here in the South, you can find mounds that are around here, both man-made and naturally occurring, that are credited to Prince Madoc.
Oh yeah, sure.
The Gaelic Prince Madoc,
Welsh,
who I
yeah,
don't
he's a
even think
Welsh
was
prince,
a real person anyway, but supposedly he marched through the southern half of the U.S. and built all of these berms because reasons. But the daughters of the daughters of the
the
South.
Daughters of the American Revolution too have
Oh,
glommed
so it's
on to
daughters of
him.
the
Yeah.
Yeah, but they put up plaques. They pay good
Yes.
money to have historical plaques put up on these sites touting these to be legitimate, and they're totally not.
Right. Yeah, it gets to be extremely complicated when I think we talked about the Heavener runestone. When you drive into the town of Heavener, their road sign, their sign welcoming you to Heavener, has a symbol, an icon of the runestone, and in letters almost as big as "Welcome to Heavener," it's home of the runestone. So
Right.
certainly local people have embraced that, and that's an interesting issue and topic for archaeologists or anthropologists of all stripes to investigate. Why do people end up um, embracing these archaeological claims that for which legitimate professional archaeologists are extremely skeptical, and yet these local folks may embrace this claim because it gives their community, it gives their region some special some special meaning or significance.
It also creates unique problems when you try to deal with this kind of an identity, because as a professional you're like, well, where's the evidence? You're like, where's the beef? And they can't provide it for you, but they still won't believe or accept anything that you provide them that is counter to that object or that story being authentic.
Right.
So
so far we've talked about artifacts that are OOPARTS that are out and out frauds, that they're historical fakes. There also are examples of artifacts that are completely legitimate. That is, the artifacts are not fraudulent, but they are bereft of context, and they are sometimes associated with places where they did not originate. What I'm saying here is that there's lots of evidence that people have been interested in archaeological artifacts for centuries, and there's been a market for antiquities for centuries. Belzoni, and what was Belzoni in the 1600s or 1700s? He was an ex-circus strongman who was in Egypt, looting sites and bringing artifacts back to Europe to sell. And the thing is that when that happens, as long as there's documentation, so that an object now is found in a museum and there's a documentation, this is where it originated. That's one thing. But it's another thing entirely especially when we're not talking about museum objects, but we're talking about things that were part of the tourist trade, that they end up traveling from, say, Egypt to Ohio because somebody traveled to Egypt in the 1800s. They wanted an Egyptian scarab. They bought it on the antiquities market brought it home. But if there's no documentation, and if they throw it out with the trash or lose it in a field, somebody finds this and says, "Oh my God, there were ancient Egyptians in Ohio." And I think I think I talked about this as an example of Wayne May, who's the editor of the Ancient American magazine, who
Right.
in a video about the Michigan relics showed this oil lamp that, and he says very clearly that he found this at an estate sale in West Virginia, and how could it have gotten there? The implication being that an oil lamp from the Middle East from 2,000 years ago, that it must have been ancient wandering Jews, the lost tribes of Israel, had been in West Virginia, lost this oil lamp, and that's how it came to West Virginia. I pointed out in I think the previous broadcast, that you can today, you can go on any one of a number of websites of antiques dealers who will sell you oil lamps verified from the Holy Land, and it's 50 or 60 bucks. My father had one. When I found an ancient Israelite oil lamp in my father's condo in Florida, I did not jump to the conclusion that the lost tribes of Israel had been in Florida thousands of years ago, because I knew that my dad had purchased this, and that's a problem now. Clearly, um, and maybe a more germane example is that there's a wonderful burial mound in Ohio called SEIP, SEIP, and I believe it's administered by the Ohio Historical Society. And when that was excavated in the 1920s, after it was professionally excavated, some folks went over to the mound site and started kicking up some of the back dirt, and they found what they believed to be a Roman coin.
Oh.
And this was really super exciting. Oh my God, there's a Roman coin here. Um, there's a wonderful article in Current Anthropology from, I believe, the 1970s, and I can give you the link to that article, where about 40 of these sites were identified all across the United States, but also in South America, where either individual Roman coins or multiple coins had been discovered. And what this guy was able to show in most of these cases is, yeah, they were legitimate Roman coins, but they were part of they were souvenirs that people had very recently, meaning sometime in the 19th or 20th centuries, had purchased, had carried with them, had dropped, had lost, had discarded, and now people are finding them thinking, oh my gosh, these are legitimate coins. This must show that ancient Romans or ancient Hebrews or ancient whoever came to the New World in antiquity. So again, that's why we talk about this idea of context, of knowing exactly, of excavating objects, of making sure we take accurate measurements, that we make sure they are in their original stratigraphic position before we draw any conclusions. So somebody picking up a coin in some back dirt, or somebody having a bag full of coins that they tell you, well, I found these in a field in Indiana, really doesn't show much, even if we're able to authenticate the coins. Now, in the case of the Seat Mound coin, which is really funny, is that when they finally got around to cleaning the coin off, they saw some letters on it. And at first, they were trying to interpret them as meaning having some sort of a Roman significance. And ultimately, when they cleaned it off enough to read it, the letters spelled out the Elgin Watch Company.
Nice.
And then somebody went back in and found out that the Elgin Watch Company had made these little facsimile Roman coin / tokens that they distributed as part of their marketing strategy. That
Nice.
Elgin watches are so good that they would outlive the Romans, or something like that. So, but you see, the point here is that you've got these objects that either are legitimate, real Roman coins, or they are facsimiles that, to the untrained eye, look a lot like Roman coins. And when there's no documentation, there's no context, there's no provenience, there's no stratigraphic associations, these things really are not terribly useful for testing a hypothesis concerning the Roman presence, or ancient Hebrew presence, or ancient Celtic presence, or ancient Norse presence in the New World in antiquity. Objects themselves are only part of the story that archaeologists, that are only part of the database that archaeologists base their stories on. Context is all important. And without that context, you know, lots of folks own old objects. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that that the ancient people who made those objects lived in the place where those people now live. These things move around considerably. They do today and they did in the past. And so again, my favorite story there, and I have to track this one down. Dean Snow, who was an archaeologist out east here, wrote an article for, I think it was when American Heritage had a magazine. Wrote an article about OOPARTS, and apparently somebody there was a parking meter somewhere on the west coast where, when they were going through all the coins at the end of the day, actually found a Roman coin in the parking meter. Apparently it was the right size and the right weight to actually be to use it, so you could use that coin so that you could to pay your parking fee.
Nice.
Nobody concluded from that there was an ancient Roman chariot had pulled up along the street, and the gladiator had put his coin in so he could park his chariot there. Um, these things are very. It's individual artifacts. Artifacts can move around substantially, and we're not talking about um, large scale immovable objects. And so again, that's why context is all important.
And I blame this kind of phenomena. And it's not like a recent phenomena. It's kind of it's just pretty historical actually. But it's just this concept that an individual object is cool. Like, you see it a lot on Facebook actually, and it irritates the crap out of me.
Right.
People will put pictures of stuff that they have found while doing a phase 1 survey. And I understand you want to share the cool thing that you found in your hole, especially after you've dug, I don't know, 15, 20 of these damn things and you found nothing, and then you get the one hole that's like the jackpot, and you want to share that with people. You're tired of looking at the same soil all day. You finally find a cool point or some pottery or anything. You have a creepy doll's head, what have you. But then they take a picture and they put it up on Facebook, or they put it up on whatever social media, and everybody goes, "Oh, that's really cool. That's a great turkey tail. That's a great this. That's a great that." And within the archaeological community, that's all well and good, because we know what we're looking at, and we understand that this is just a piece of the puzzle. This isn't the puzzle. But for so long, you have these, American Antiquity and Archaeology magazine, and even the Smithsonian and all of those. The first thing you see are all of these big, bright, dazzling, cool looking artifacts. There's no site associated with them. You might get a little write up about, this is where this was found, this is who found it, this is what it says about a culture, but you're still just looking at this big, beautiful, glossy picture of an artifact. And so it's in the American, or it's in the human brain now, that I find a shiny pebble, and that shiny pebble is cool, and that's all I need. I just need the shiny pebble, and now I can prove everything that I need to prove. And it's like, no, you need the context of the shiny pebble as well. Like, that 30th hole that archaeologist had just dug is in context with the other 29 that they've dug that are all empty, and that's going to help him create a picture of the site. He just happened to find an artifact in that hole, which lets us know that potentially there's a site here. Now we have to find the big site, which is more than just this one little piece of artifact.
Yeah, it's one of a huge problem there, which is a topic for an entire podcast, is that unfortunately that gives people the impression that what we really are involved in is a treasure hunt.
Yeah.
That we're looking for treasures, and we find treasures, and we get really excited about those treasures. Now, I don't mind it if we use those kinds of flashy things to draw people in. That's how we cast this net. We say,
right.
Oh, look at these shiny things. And then we say, now, wait a minute. Now that you're paying attention, here's why we're looking for this stuff, and here's what it tells us about people, and here's what it tells us about the history of humanity. So The old expression that people used to use in archaeology was that we are looking for the Indian behind the artifact.
Right.
And it's kind of an old-fashioned way of putting it, and maybe it's offensive, but the bottom line here is, yeah, it's the artifacts they are merely our tools to get at what we're really interested in, which is how people cobbled together a life at a particular place in a particular time. So what their adaptation was. That you obviously on the cover of Archaeology magazine, you can't put a photograph of an adaptation or of cultures evolving or responding to environmental challenges. But you can put a photograph of a beautiful sculpture or an impressive pyramid
That's
or
true.
a lovely gold necklace. And as long as that's just a trick we play on people to pull them in and say, okay, now here's what's important. I guess I don't mind it that much.
All right, well, we're going to take a real quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to wax poetically about how much I love soil stains. So.
The CRM Archaeology podcast brings together a panel of cultural resource management professionals to discuss the issues that really matter to the profession. Find out about networking strategies, job hunting, graduate programs, and much more. We'll often feature interviews with college professors, CRM business owners, and experts as well. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/CRM Arc Podcast. Let's get back to the show.
So, I want to talk about, I know we're kind of off topic, but we're not off topic at this point. I love soil stains. I would rather see site photographs of different stains and walls, and by walls I mean wall prints, footprints of the walls, not the actual walls themselves. I want to see the structures. I want to see the dirt. I want to see the ground. I want to see the structures and the hearths and the trash pits, and I want to see everything else. I could actually care less about the physical artifacts other than what the physical artifact is telling me about the stain that it's associated with, because they're always associated with something.
I'm going to agree with you. Stains are pretty damn cool.
Stains are amazing.
A brief story. We were along this little brook that feeds into the Farmington River, and we are down a couple of feet, and there's nothing. The soil is completely clean. There is no staining, no modeling, and we get to about 2 feet, and suddenly, Sarah, we start seeing. You stand up and you go, "Wait a minute! There's this black." Kind of vaguely black modeling that we hadn't seen before, and it wasn't just shadows. And we continued going down, and instead of modeling, it became a solid rectangle of black, and it got darker. And then we started seeing these stones that clearly had been in a fire were popping up, meaning that we were going down on top of them. By the time we were done, we had a platform of burned stones filled with charcoal all around them that was about, 6 feet by 5 feet on a side. And then mixing with all that charcoal, we found bits of deer bone. And then right adjacent to this platform, we found a broken spear point. Only the tip had been broken off. And the bone was deer bone, and it clearly, that's a roasting platform.
Yeah.
But it doesn't show up all at once. It shows up as this kind of vague discoloration of the soil. You're right. That's totally exciting.
To me, that is far more exciting, because that to me is, because like you said, you dig and you dig and you don't see anything, or you'll see a root run and you get all excited because it's a root run, and then you figure out it's a root run, and then you hate trees, and then you keep digging and you keep digging, and then you find the thing and you're like, oh, that's weird, so you make a note of it, and then you take it down further and you're like, okay, my weird thing's getting bigger, and like now you want to chase that feature. But that feature is more than just the deer bone that you found and the broken spear point. It's those rocks that you found, the charred rocks and the pieces of charcoal, and the soil itself is part of that feature. And this is what the public never gets to see or hear about, really, is the fact that that feature is more than just the stain on the surface, it's the stain, and it's the modeling, and it's the clay balls, and it's the rocks themselves, and it's the overall shape, and it's also that spear point, and it's probably, the other smaller hearth that was a little farther away,
Right.
and maybe the post holes for the teepee or whatever that was where they lived while they were roasting these giant animals, and also the trash pile where they threw the bones away after they were done smoking all the meat. It's all of that all together, but yet
Yes.
all you will see is a picture of that spear point that you found.
Yes. Everybody who's listening to this podcast, you're listening to an archaeologist, because only an archaeologist, as you say, could wax poetic about a soil stain. And I'm here enthralled. Yeah, go, you go, because that's what it's about. It's a moment frozen in time.
Yes.
And the particular the charcoal that we sent off for radiocarbon dating for the roasting platform that I'm talking about was 4,250 years
That's
old. So
awesome.
you've got, oh my God, so you've got this 4,250 years after somebody did something as mundane as butcher and cook a deer. We are there. We have traveled back in time, and obviously they're gone. The deer is gone, but we are able to reconstruct what happened at that place 4 millennia ago. I mean, it really is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
But when I show Sarah, when I show people photographs of my roasting platform, they go, "Oh, yeah, that's nice. It's rocks." And then I show them a photograph of the spear point with just the tip broken off, the
Yeah.
smoking gun. They go, "Ooh, pretty," and they want to look at the spear point. But
I want
that's
to
just
see your
that's
broken
that's the
rock.
nature of the beast, you know.
This is why I don't get that fired up about PPKs, because I'm like, it's a freaking rock. You're just showing me a chipped up rock. I don't care.
Okay. Right.
And then but then they're like, yeah, but we found this rock and this pottery and this stain, and I'm like, ooh, stains.
But that's
I like the dirt.
But part of the thing here too, Sarah, is that you very rarely hear about. You sometimes do about fake features, because those are hard to make.
Yes.
Anybody, you can make a spear point, you can make a fraudulent artifact and scratch Hebrew into it, but to reconstruct from nothing an entire archaeological village, or even a feature, and to make it look good enough so that it would fool an archaeologist, man, that's really hard to do. And so most of the hoaxsters, they don't even try. They just, they don't have the talent or the skill or the knowledge to do that, but they can toss off a fake artifact. Which actually brings me to another issue, which I think will lead very nicely into Andy's discussion of the Roman sword. Now, so far we've talked about fake artifacts, out and out frauds. We've talked about out of place genuine artifacts, but simply because there's an antiquities market, an antiquities trade, and stuff ends up all over the world, and merely because you find it in a basement in New York doesn't mean it started off there. It means it got there in the 20th century. But there's another thing going on here, is that because there's always been long been an interest in antiquities, and because antiquities can be expensive, right? The supply is constrained. There are just so many Clovis points out there, but the demand is high. There's a market for not intentionally fraudulent artifacts, but artifacts that are made as replicas. So that you want to have an Indian spear point. There are shops all up and down the East Coast where you can walk in, and there's a bucket full of clearly fake artifacts, fake spear points. They're unifacially retouched. They're really horrible. They've been done with metal tools. But you're a little kid. You want an Indian arrowhead, more scare quotes, and your parents can buy you one of those for $1.50.
Right.
Now, just honest to God, Sarah, at the end of this past semester, a wonderful student, really bright young woman, came up to me and said, "My brother has this. He wants to know if it's real." And she showed me what is one of these $1.50 Indian arrowheads that you can buy at lots of shops here on the East Coast. And I recognized it immediately as one of these fake things. As no, that's fake. And she was crestfallen because, well, it looks legit. They're not. Now, the person who made those, the company that makes those, they're not intending to pass them off as legit. It's just that, well, this is an easy and cheap way for you to own a genuine replica. I've actually seen them labeled as such, genuine replica. But my favorite story about this was I had a student, actually wasn't one of my students, but a student who was at my university who came into my office and the office of one of my colleagues and said, "Hey, look, you guys are archaeologists. I found this. I think it's an Indian arrowhead. Can you tell me if it's legit?" And he opened up his hand and I saw it. And Sarah, I was like flabbergasted because along with being, turned on by soil stains, I'm also kind of excited by artifacts. And this guy had in his hand what looked from a distance, it looked like it was a Clovis point. It was a fluted point. It was black. Those
That's
things
cool.
are, especially here in Connecticut, very rare. We have only a handful of them. And for
I'm
those
not gonna lie,
listening,
a Clovis point would get me excited.
pretty exciting. Clovis points date to 11,500, 12,000, 13,000 years ago. So we're looking at some of the old, certainly the oldest diagnostic artifacts we have in the New World. Now there are older artifacts now. There are pre-Clovis sites, but Clovis is pretty damn exciting. And these are folks who are hunting, woolly mammoths and mastodons and megafauna. So he had it in his hand and said, "May I hold it?" And he said, "Oh, sure." And I picked it up. And my immediate reaction was, whoa, something's wrong. Because based on the size of this artifact, it was way too light. There's no stone that I'm aware of that at that size would be as light as this. And when I looked at it carefully, I thought, oh my God, I see a seam along the edge of the artifact. And I recognized immediately it was plastic. So what the guy told me was that he had been out walking, hiking behind his old high school and saw some like ripped up ground, bent over, saw this thing, got really excited, and of course the first thing he decided to do was come and show it to me because I'm, the archaeologist on campus.
Right.
It was clearly plastic. I had to say, "Hey, look, man, this is some kind of a replica." I'm convinced he wasn't trying to fool me, that he really didn't know that it wasn't real. I took some pictures of it, and I talked about it to one of my colleagues who's a little older than I am. And this is Mark Banks, who's an archaeologist here in Connecticut. And he said, "Kenny, I remember very clearly when I was a little kid that one of the major cereal companies put in as little marketing strategy to get little kids to want to buy that cereal. They put that in each box was a different Indian artifact." And Clovis points were among the ones they put in. So back in the day when he was a little kid, he's pushing probably 66 or 67 now. When he was a little kid, your mom would get you these, chocolate crunchies or whatever. And in that box would be an artifact and it would say, "Collect them all." So you'd want your mom to go back to the supermarket and get more boxes of the chocolate crunchies. And so you'd have this whole collection. Well, stuff like that, there's no documentation. It didn't come with much information. And if some kid's out playing out in the woods playing hunter and they lose them, they throw them away or whatever, what happens is decades later, some poor kid picks it up and says, "Oh my God, I've got a legitimate artifact." And it turns out to be a replica. Now, there's no intention of fraud here. There's no intention of fooling anybody. It's just, again, there are replica artifacts, and you know what? A plastic Clovis point put in a cereal box is pretty damn easy to diagnose. When we start getting to expensive artifact replicas that are produced as part of this, the market of the market in which people are interested in antiquities, it becomes progressively more difficult for somebody to simply pick one up and say, "Oh, yeah, this is a fake." But in fact, detailed analysis has to be performed in order to ascertain what's the raw material, what was the technology involved in producing this object, and if we find that, for example, I know that we're going to try to get Jeb back on to talk about the moose stones, and he's having those analyzed. And one of the things he's looking for is there a way of identifying the technology that was used to produce those, and was that when did that particular technology, when was that particular technology invented, because the object can't date to before that. But that becomes a little bit more serious, and a more serious investigation. You've got to do more research, and that, I think, brings us to this general question of, well, what happens when these replicas lose connection to their documentation, lose that little card that comes with it that says, this is a genuine replica made by this company, and here's what we base it on. And what happens when that card disappears, and that, whether it's a sword or a coin from the Elgin watch company, is then found in a context that is not somebody's basement or not somebody's attic, but maybe it's in a pile of garbage, or maybe it's in the woods, maybe it's in the back dirt of a mound site, and people start getting overly excited about what that object implies.
And see, this is where research comes in, because
yeah, absolutely.
In today's modern era, I mean, maybe 50, 60 years ago it was different, but in today's modern era, we can trace most of that stuff down. And I think anytime you find something out of place like that, your first thing you should do is be like, okay, who brought this here? Who modernly brought this here, and where did they get it from? And that would be my starting point. I would immediately start looking at reproductions. And if I couldn't somehow find something that lined up with it, or unsatisfactorily lines up with it, then I would move on to the next step of, okay, maybe this got here some other way. But my first conclusion, and no one's first conclusion, should ever be, Romans brought this sword here,
Right. That's not that ultimately, you're applying Occam's razor. That's kind of there. We have to go through a lot of steps before we come to that conclusion. And of course, we'll talk to Andy next for the next podcast. We hope we can get Andy to tell us. All right, what steps has anybody actually applied to this object in order to come to the conclusion that no, it's legitimate and it's Roman. I have a friend of mine, Terry Del Bene, who taught me everything I know about lithic replication. And Terry was a guy he is very, very talented at making stone tools. And Terry etches his name into every stone tool that he produces. Because he says, hey, listen, I think some of the stuff I do is good enough to fool people. I don't want anybody looking at this particular point and thinking it's legit. My name is on it with a date, and that's an important point. That too many of these things, the in the case of the Elgin Watch Company, well, we have that. If we didn't have those letters, if we didn't have that logo on that token, it would have been that much more difficult to ascertain its exact temporal and geographic provenience.
And a lot of the modern reputable replica companies do hide their insignia on the replica somewhere. Because I've got a couple pieces from there because I collect Hobbit stuff, and but they do.
So it's not legitimate Hobbit stuff?
No, it's not actually
not actually made by the hobbits.
No, it's not an actual elven blade. It just looks like one.
Damn.
I know, right? I was so disappointed. It didn't glow when I got close to my ex, but but I know that they do that on the other swords and armors and stuff that they make, because they do some beautiful replica, and I think it's just called the Replica Company.
Oh yeah.
But they do beautiful work. I feel like once you get outside of that, I mean, once you start dealing with replicas where they're not identifying the maker, I feel like you're crossing into some shady area there where you're getting away from replicas for the pleasure of replicating, and you're getting into possible fraud, possible making of frauds.
Well, at the very least, a company making replicas has to be aware of the fact that if the replica is good enough, that even if they're not intending to fake anybody, that some unscrupulous person down the line is going to realize, you know what, if I sell this as a real thing, I will make a lot more money than if I honestly tell people, no, it's only a replica.
Or if you get, like you were saying, 10 years, 20 years from now, this object changes hands and it gets separated away from its little card of authenticity.
Right.
I don't think your grandkid is trying to fraud people, but they find a cool object. Like, we had this incident happen with a baseball we found when my grandfather passed away. It had Babe Ruth's signature on it.
Oh my God!
And of course, we know nothing about baseball. So we're all like, ooh, a baseball with Babe Ruth's signature. Let's see how much it's worth. And of course, the guy comes and looks at it and he goes, nah, this was mass produced to promote one of the World Series. It's worth like
Right.
$20.
Sure.
But we didn't know any better. And we weren't trying to fraud anyone.
Oh, right. Oh, no, you see something like that, and of course you get excited. But see, now here's the thing, Sarah. You didn't immediately announce to the world
No,
on
I
a
did not.
website, we have Babe Ruth's signature, and this is going to we have to rewrite the history books. Obviously, you went to somebody who would know whether it was authentic or not,
Right.
and found out, in fact, it wasn't, or it wasn't hand signed by Babe Ruth.
Right.
But it's an important point to make, and it's certainly something that anybody claiming whether it's a Roman sword or any other object claiming that this is legit, and especially claiming that this particular artifact has amazing implications, and we're going to need to rewrite history. There's due diligence that has to be undertaken there to, in fact, show that this thing is legitimate, and ultimately where was it found? What is its context? Even a legitimate Roman sword a really ancient Roman sword found in Nova Scotia, don't mean nothing if you don't know what exact. Let's see the photographs of this thing in situ, in its
Right.
actual stratigraphic context,
Right.
before we start talking about, we need to start rewriting history books.
Right.
Because I'm going to bet you there probably are people in the United States who have authentic Roman swords in their possession.
Yeah.
Because they bought them through an antiquities dealer, or they're, so but again, what does that mean? The antiquities market is fluid and widespread, and I'm quite certain this will be interesting, actually, Sarah, because I know that especially Japanese collectors and German collectors many of them are very interested in Native American artifacts, and so there's a big market for pottery and for
Right.
stone tools and for jewelry in Japan and in Germany. Now,
That's interesting, though.
But now the thing is, Sarah, what's going to happen in 20 years when somebody in Germany says, I can prove that Native Americans
Right.
thousands of years ago came to Germany because we have found authentic, and they would be authentic, Native American artifacts here. That's actually interesting. I'm not aware, and if anybody's listening, maybe they can clue us in on that. I'm not aware of any claims in the old world, either in Asia or Europe or Africa, of the discovery of Native American artifacts and then interpreting those to mean that Native Americans sailed across the Atlantic or the Pacific long before Columbus and landed on the coast of England or something like that.
Now that you mentioned that, yeah, I don't think I've ever heard the reverse claims like that. But I mean, this topic, we could go on for another hour on this topic. It boils down to two things one thing that we say pretty frequently, and that's show me the trash. And I think the other thing that I'm going to start saying is show me the dirt. I want to see the dirt that you pulled it out of, and I want to see the trash associated with it, the cultural trash. But we're gonna have to extend this out to another episode in the future, and if Andy White hasn't picked up on the deep hint that we want to have him on the show,
No. I'm sure it's just at this point, Andy is more than happy to do it. I think at this point it's just a matter of scheduling. Let's see if we can get him scheduled. But this is something that, again, you can't pick up. You can't open up your browser and look at your science news feed without hearing claims that scientists have found a Roman sword in Nova Scotia, and fairly recently, it's like one of the top 10 amazing discoveries of 2015, which is just heartbreaking, considering how little evidence there is for it. But we're going to leave that for Andy to clear it all up for us.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap this up. Ken, thank you very much. I think
it's been awesome, Sarah.
We've definitely taken a chunk out of OOPARTS, so.
All right.
I will catch you next time, hopefully with Andy. So, take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Raging trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeology Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archaeofantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeofantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.